And I think there might have been people at those protests activated by a directive by, say, the South Australian government that people even in Christian schools or non-government schools would have to be vaccinated by about the 11th of December or they can't keep working at a school. So I think that's starting to cross over into these religious freedom concerns. And I caught up with Wendy Francis, the Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby, and she's told us, look, there's a whole bunch of things this religious freedom bill that nobody's seen yet isn't actually going to fix.
And welcome back to The Flow. It's good to have your company. And on the weekend, there were protest walks, marches right across the nation. Between 500,000 and 1 million people, it has been estimated, have attended them. And it's been a real eye-opener, and maybe for politicians, a time of reckoning. Rikki Lambert's with me in our studios to talk about that, and also the next phase of what could become a time of reckoning, a religious freedom bill. Rikki, how are you?
Great, thank you.
I want to ask you first about the protest marches. They're massive numbers, and while politicians, particularly those on the Labor side, have been at pains to call people that walked on the weekend extremists, it appears that there is a very latent response out in the community of concern about both the mandatory nature of vaccination.
There have been big turnouts, and media outlets other than our own have been sort of trying to say there was only hundreds there or maybe 1,000 or so, but the reporting is now starting to pick up there were a lot more people there than first reported by the media. So I think it's time to get a bit of more truth into what the figures are. I've seen the video of the protest in Adelaide, for instance, and the advertiser was initially saying there was hundreds there, but I could see about 500 just in one shot of the crowd. So there clearly was thousands there at that march.
There were thousands. The police actually, at the early stages of the gathering, had estimated more than 10,000. So that was official. And for people to be reporting otherwise is quite disappointing reporting. But let's go to more of what this does show us. And we've got the Parliament sitting again, and we've got 4 senators now that have said they won't give their vote to the coalition. At the same time, the coalition's looking to introduce some legislation about religious freedoms. But it's not going to be making everyone happy.
No, and I think there might have been people at those protests activated by a directive by, say, the South Australian government that people even in Christian schools or non-government schools would have to be vaccinated by about the 11th of December or they can't keep working at a school. So I think that's starting to cross over into these religious freedom concerns. And I caught up with Wendy Francis, the Director of Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby, and she's told us, look, there's a whole bunch of things this religious freedom bill that nobody's seen yet isn't actually going to fix.
I do think the bill is going to be unremarkable in one way, in providing, but it will provide some basic protections. It doesn't address some of the flashpoints, for religious hostility, because we're seeing that in the real world. There is overreach of employers into employees' private speech. There is the misuse of hate speech laws against religious expression. There are threats to churches and families from the so-called conversion therapy laws, when you can't even pray for somebody without being caught under that. And there is increasing attacks on the ability for Christian schools to operate according to their ethos.
Yes, there's a whole list of concerns or complaints that the Australian Christian Lobby really say they're quite disappointed, not only with the bill, but Wendy Francis went on to tell me they're actually quite disappointed with the coalition government itself, that we're this close to an election, they still haven't got anywhere on religious freedom laws passing the Parliament. Here's what else she had to say about the coalition's effort or lack thereof.
We represent close to 300,000 supporters, and we are really disappointed. I understand that COVID has sort of come in the way of a lot of stuff getting through the Parliament. I totally get that. But when the government wants to get something through, they can get it through pretty quickly. So I think it is disappointing. I think it is representative of the way that there is turmoil even within the coalition. I don't think, we're not going to see every coalition member want to support this bill either. So it's just indicative of a party that is not totally committed to religious freedom.
And there is, I think, in the community a growing concern about whether or not our freedoms are being eroded, if people are losing their jobs. And we go through the list of them. There were the construction workers that under a lockdown initially began their protests. They also were not backed by their own union, and so a new union has been formed. And then we go to the police officers and nurses, and then we head to the general public in the Victorian legislation that, in effect, that most professions required people to be vaccinated. In South Australia, new edicts being given for school teachers as well as nurses. And from what I've been told by those that attended at the protest march in Adelaide, there appeared to be a lot of nurses in uniform that were actually walking along the streets, and I think giving a real signal to the government that they're not happy about what's happened to them.
Well, there is a real concern, I think, across the community from the people who are very law-abiding to those who might not be, about freedoms in general. I remember these protests in South Australia with the anti-bikie laws, and that drew a very disparate and wide range of people protesting against the principle. And I think that's the important thing here is while some might look at an element at these protests that they want to cast shade on and say, well, these protests are illegitimate because of a minority who are there, I think the broad numbers that are turning out to them from very law-abiding people that are participating in them in their nurses' uniforms and what like means it's becoming hard for governments to resist, or oppositions. I see the Liberal opposition, Shadow Treasurer in Victoria, gave comments over the weekend that he doesn't regret speaking at those rallies despite some of the criminal element that might be there. So I think it's becoming hard for politicians to resist or pretend that these protests aren't happening.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be hard for them to resist it, but will they resist legislating at a federal level within a religious discrimination bill or within a religious freedom bill, or how will those terms be used when they finalise that bill? We're going to find that out more over the next couple of months as we get closer to the next federal election.